Other council members? Mr. Ray?
No.
No, okay. All right. Members of the public, I've got the blue sheets from yesterday where people said they were going to talk about certain things. I'll go back to them. Mr. Harum didn't indicate a subject. I don't see him in the audience from the city of Stockton. Mr. Mills, you are here. You had indicated a desire to speak on the definitional sections.
Mr. Chairman, I did, but we reconciled that yesterday with the conversation and sidebar I had with Ms.
Okay.
Davis.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Wallace had a one-year transfer discussion point. He told us he could not be here today. Mr. Zlotnick wanted to talk about the definitional stuff under Section FF, which we've been talking about. I don't see him. Mr. Ringelberg from Land. Mr. Ringelberg.
Thank you, Chair and Council members. My name is Eric Ringelberg. I'm with local agencies of the North Delta Coalition of 14 Reclamation and Water Districts. The definition of encroachment on page 18.
Page 18.
It's fourth letter from down, O, lowercase o. Relates back to RRP3 and RRP4, which I'll talk about when we get to those sections. But I wanted to just identify while we're talking about this, while this definition of encroachment was taken from the Central Valley Flood Protection Board's definition, it's been our position with the board, and I'll bring it forward to the council as well, that we feel that this definition is overly broad. Essentially, by defining any encroachment as any obstruction or the removal of an obstruction by any means for any purpose, essentially defeats the purpose of having this regulation for our purposes. And let me give you an illustration of what that might mean. So if we were to work on a habitat restoration project in the Delta, which we have several proposals for that exceed the 5 acre de minimis limit, say putting in a version of Dr. Hart's willow boxes, which reduce erosion along levees and add habitat for fish. Essentially, we come under this term because it is an encroachment. Same with removing arundo and other invasive weed species along the levees falls under the same issue. The Corps now requires coarse woody debris placed along levees, yet another encroachment. And we feel that under the terms of RRP3 and RRP4, which we'll talk about later, that this definition is frankly too restrictive to allow us to do the things that we talk about.
Am I correct that that's an argument you made to the Central Valley Flood Board without success, and you're now making it? Talk to me about the notion of having different standards.
Sure.
Understandably, two-thirds of the Delta or Susan Marsh are outside of the authority of the Flood Board, but we've been trying to standardize our approaches as best we can, because folks like yourself usually say, don't have different standards, we barely can keep up with the one you guys adopt as a unit. So why?
Absolutely understood. I actually think the board would not stipulate that they don't have authority over most of the Delta. They've clearly defined that they have. And we'll talk more about that, I think, in detail in RRP3 and P4, where the argument by staff, and I think maybe meritorious, is that it's the degree of enforcement by the Flood Board or its interpretation of its regulations in portions of the Delta. That's the gap that you're trying to fill with your policy. And so in terms of that, while we're essentially stuck with and have to stipulate, of course, to the Rec Board, if the intent of this is to fill a gap where the Rec Board isn't filling it, it interferes with the other policies as stated, the way it's written.
Okay. And we'll get your testimony when we roll back to the previous policies we passed over.
Absolutely. And I'd be more than happy to work with staff to get to the nut of it, which I think is hydraulic obstruction.
Okay. Thank you, sir.